All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming back to check out the latest episode of the podcast. This one is going to be a little bit different than most other podcasts that I've recorded. Usually I'm doing some sort of interview or maybe a monologue, but today I am joined by my co-GP, Sam Tabone, and we are going to just have a conversation where neither of us is really leading or interviewing, and the conversation is going to be us sort of talking through this new term that we have coined for our thesis or view on the markets or view on the types of startups that we want to invest. There's a somewhat long story about how we got here from our beginnings back in 2021 when we were largely focused on psychedelic medicine. But now we have this term Human 3 that we launched back in January. And so this podcast is going to be Sam and I just walking through what is Human 3, what is Human 3 not, what are some case studies for companies that we think sort of exemplify what Human 3 is, and where we think Human 3 can go in the future. So I'm really excited to do this. Sam, thank you so much for joining me and for being a co-instigator of Human 3.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here. It's definitely been a long time since we did something like this. I feel like you said a lot has happened. There's a lot to talk about. And now that we've settled into San Francisco, it feels like now's the right time to do it. So thanks for having me again.
Yeah. How about you tell, just to give people an idea of where we started and where we are now, can you describe the state of the fund when you met me in June of 2022 and when we started working together in August of 2022?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, when I met you, I think you had made already about 10 investments, and the general theme was psychedelics. So most of the investments that you had in biotech had to do with some kind of psychoactive or psychedelic compound. And, you know, I think you were looking for some support on the technical diligence side. It just so happened that I was a good fit for that. And we started working together on a project to evaluate a company called XyloBio, which I believe actually ended up being one of the last psychedelic investments that we did out of Fund 1. Flash forward to today, I think we're at 24 companies now in Fund 1.
Yeah. And the reason that it was one of the last psychedelic investments wasn't because we just decided we don't like psychedelics anymore. It was for two reasons. One of them being that there just weren't a lot of new psychedelic focused companies being started, and there still aren't today. And the other thing is that as time went on, we started kind of building our name and reputation up. We started getting deal flow in adjacent areas, things like neuromodulation and brain-computer interfaces, and later on, genetic medicine. There were different modalities, different technologies, if you will, that were still trying to solve the same problems that psychedelics are trying to solve, namely disorders of the brain and things like neurodegeneration and psychiatric disorders. So we decided, why don't we invest in these other sort of opportunities that are similar along the same lines? And after a while, you know, as of today, there's like 24 companies in the portfolio, 25. It's hard to count after 20.
Yeah.
And it, like I said, it's a mix of the BCIs, the psychedelics, the genetic medicine. We also did some sort of one-off opportunistic stuff in consumer-facing longevity with our portfolio company Superpower that just raised a $30 million Series A. And also a company in the sexual wellness and performance space, Cadence Bio, that's trying to develop the first FDA-approved treatment for premature ejaculation. So at this point, the portfolio looks very different than a pure psychedelics portfolio, which is what I initially thought is what was going to happen back in 2021. And we realized that basically we needed clear, precise language that we could use to describe the types of companies that we're looking to invest in going forward that still fits all of the companies that we had invested in the past. And that was, I guess, flexible enough to adjust over time and allow us to invest in new things that, as you know, technological trends and breakthroughs happen, and there's sort of new types of companies that are available to invest in. So we came up with this concept of Human 3, which is basically the third epoch of health, well-being, and performance.
Yeah, I was going to say, it would be interesting to before we get into what Human 3 is and all that stuff, I think it would be interesting to talk about what you learned in terms of having very restrictive language around what it is that you're investing in. Because we talked about the fact that we didn't just decide to stop investing in psychedelics. There was a limit to how many companies could get started. Xylo isn't even really a psychedelic company. They're a drug discovery company that's inspired by psychedelic compounds. So I would like to know, in your opinion, what do you think the constraints of that precise language was?
Well, I'll tell you the benefits of the psychedelic focus at the beginning were that it made it somewhat easy to, in quotes, easy to raise money because there were certain people that were very interested in investing in psychedelics, and I was one of the only people that was running a fund focused on it. And so I could say, hey, if you want to invest in psychedelics, I'm probably the only fund manager you know, so you should give me money. And the pitch was as simple as that. And if you don't want to invest in psychedelics, then we can go our separate ways. But restrictive language is not good if the industry that you're focused on goes through a downturn and there are no new companies to invest in. That's not good. And it also, I think at the end of the day, especially in like the health space, the goal should really not be around a specific modality. It should be around the human outcome. It should be around treating people. And so if there are other technologies that are going to solve the problem, it's kind of almost ethically wrong to not back those at the same time.
I couldn't agree more. I think the modality has a lot to do with it. Obviously now, today, we have a variety of modalities in the portfolio.
And so but the challenge then becomes, if you've become known for doing one thing and then you start expanding into other things, you kind of lose that precision around the language that you use when you're pitching your fund. So during 2024, when we would talk to prospective LPs, they would say, what do you do? And it's like, well, we do a lot of stuff focused on neuro or the brain. What is neuro? Who knows what neuro is? We do a lot of stuff focused on neuro. And then we also have this like sexual performance company. We also have this consumer longevity company. And it's sort of like frontier healthcare. And then you realize that there's like 300 other funds that have frontier healthcare written on the front page of their website. And then you're like, well, we're sort of like biotech. And then people are like, well, isn't biotech really like capital intensive and scary? And I lost money in biotech. Why do I want to invest in biotech? And by the way, you also have this consumer, actually not just one consumer company, a few consumer companies in your portfolio. So it became very cumbersome to try and figure out how to describe what we were doing. And that is why we sat down in January and said, let's figure out a term that we can use, that we can say in like 3 seconds that refers to all the stuff that we do. And that was Human 3.
Yeah. And I think, I don't know about you, but I feel like over the past 3 years, obviously we've worked together quite a bit. And this process of deciding what this term Human 3 wasn't necessarily retrofitting a concept to our portfolio companies. I felt like it was more of a mental exercise in reflecting on why we thought there was an opportunity and what that opportunity was and what influenced it. And so without further ado, could you do us the honors of reading the Human 3 Manifesto?
Yeah, so this was a manifesto, you got to have a manifesto that I wrote back in January. It'll probably take me like a minute and a half to read. It's not very long. And already, just looking at it, there are things that I'm cringing at and that I maybe don't agree with anymore. And so obviously, the manifesto may be revised soon. But this is the day that we came up with Human 3. This is what we thought it meant. So here's the manifesto. XEIA invests in early-stage startups driving Human 3, the next epoch of human health, well-being, and performance. While modern medicine, which is Human 2, benefited society in incalculable ways, it ultimately fell short of its promise because the available tools forced it to operate at an incremental pace with long feedback loops. But today, exponential technologies like AI, which can parse through terabytes of scientific literature and data in seconds, and brain-computer interfaces, biosensors, and CRISPR, which enable real-time read-write access to our biology, promise to rapidly accelerate the scientific method flywheel and lead to an exponential explosion in health, wellness, and performance. Well-being, it should say. Human 3 will elevate every area of health and well-being, but will have the biggest impact in areas where modern medicine has made the least progress: the mental health crisis, neurodegeneration, chronic disease, and aging. These are the focus points of our investment strategy. We don't view Human 3 as a sector. Our companies combine life sciences, AI, hardware, software, deep tech, and health tech in novel ways that often defy conventional categorization. Human 3 is instead a philosophy of vitality. It is a knowing that the user experience of the human body and mind is long overdue for an upgrade. It is the willingness to build and invest in that future. This is Human 3. You can tell right there that we had just moved to San Francisco and we're like getting on the hype train.
What, the philosophy of vitality?
That's right. It's not a thesis, it's a religion.
Yeah.
So I'm kind of cringing at myself here. So almost done. Here's the final bits of the manifesto. This Human 3 movement marks the third great epoch of human health. Human 1 was defined by medieval practices like bloodletting and humorism, medicine before evidence. Human 2 was the era of modern medicine, which began in the 1850s when Louis Pasteur pasteurized the germ theory of disease, and the scientific method became the gold standard. Human 2 was constrained by both incremental tools and artificial boundaries between disciplines. But Human 3 builds on Human 2's legacy of scientific rigor, but is accelerated by exponential technologies, cross-disciplinary collaborations, and driven by a belief that we can do so much more to not just heal the sick, but to prevent illness in the first place and elevate the already healthy. All right, so that's the manifesto. I have some thoughts, but Sam, what are 3 months after writing this, what are your views? Because I think we both thought it was pretty cool at the time.
Yeah.
Now that we've let it cool off, where does it hit? Where does it miss?
Can I just say before I give you my answer, you speak very clearly, and I already hear myself tripping up on words, and I need to get into this a little bit more. So clearly we're going to have to do more of these so I can get used to it. But maybe. I think I said do us the honors instead of do us the honor. But anyhow, you asked me what felt the most cringy or what I felt like maybe was missing or that I would change 3 months later. And I think that Human 3 in this manifesto does a great job of explaining what exactly it is that we're looking for. What I think is missing is explaining why the opportunity is now and why Human 3 is an opportunity specifically, which to me is accounted for not just by the technology itself, but by market forces, by regulatory environments, by sociocultural elements. And I just feel like that's missing from this a little bit.
Yeah, it's true. We focused primarily on the new technologies, which are real. Like, even though AI is overhyped, it is true that AI is allowing people to do new things at a rapid pace in science. And these new brain-computer interfaces and imaging tools and biosensors and CRISPR, those are all real accelerants. But they're not the only thing that is ushering in this new era.
Dare we say catalysts? What are the other catalysts?
And you mentioned some of them, the regulatory changes that are now happening at the FDA. The social elements, I think, are possibly even more important than both the technological ones and the regulatory changes. So, I mean, what do you, when you think of like the moment that we are in socially, what do you think?
Well, just today I read something like this probably every week, but I saw that Gen Z is the most sober generation, the least alcohol consuming generation. And so I think number one is that there's a greater emphasis and pride in taking care of your own health. And I think that's just simply because we have access to a lot more knowledge and people are more educated on what it is to be healthy. I think that's probably one of them. What about you?
Yeah, I think it also, there are, I mean, just a few things that you can point to, like the fact that Brian Johnson has a documentary on Netflix that when it came out was, I think, one of the top documentaries for a while on Netflix. Not now, it's probably not anymore, but that was in January of this year. I don't know that a biohacking documentary would be anywhere near the top of the charts, even just a few years prior. You also look at the fact that a company like Function Health, which basically does, allows you to spend $500 on a comprehensive blood diagnostics panel. That company just raised at a $2 billion valuation. They're presumably making tons of cash to justify that valuation. I don't know that a company like that would have been a success just 5 to 10 years ago. And if I had to guess what is like the single biggest driver of consumers starting to take the matters of health into their own hands more than they were before, I think it is kind of just like this post-COVID thing.
Oh, yeah.
Prior to COVID, obviously there have always been people that really cared about health. But I think there was largely just kind of like a deference to doctors and to like, if I get sick, I'll go to the doctor and that'll be that. Yeah. And outside of that, I'm not really going to do much unless I'm someone who's kind of in like the niche, like fitness, health and wellness communities. But after COVID, when you consider that there are people who now, even like 2 years later, have these sort of like long COVID symptoms, things like POTS, things like
dysautonomia.
Right. There's all these people that are now struggling with these diseases that the mainstream, and I shouldn't use the word mainstream, it makes me sound like some conspiracy theorist, but like the medical establishment, for all the good things about the medical establishment, doesn't have an answer for. And so there's a huge number of people now that are starting to like, not because they want to, but they're forced to start paying attention to this stuff on their own. And they're very invested in like living in a society where there are new answers available.
Yeah. I mean, during COVID, the healthcare system was pressure tested to a maximum. And at the same time, we all had a lot more time on our hands, for better or for worse, to reflect on how we could get better. There was a lot of uncertainty around what COVID could and could not do to people. And even afterwards, you mentioned long COVID, I think there was a lot of anxiety around what these random symptoms or episodes that people were experiencing actually was. I think that was also around the time when, you started to see articles like, maybe this was a little bit afterwards, one of the Hemsworth brothers who like talked about how he had this like ApoE4 genetic mutation that made him predisposed for neurodegeneration. Even though it's not technically related, I did see a lot of articles about celebrities' health after that. And I think it just scared a lot of people, for sure.
And I also think I don't want to talk about COVID too much because human 3 is not confined to like immediate effects of COVID. But the Ryan Haight Act, which I'm not going to get into the weeds, but it was basically a rule change that happened during COVID that allowed telehealth companies to do a lot more prescribing online without an in-person doctor's visit. That really opened the floodgates to this idea that consumers could just go on their phone and get prescribed medications as kind of they wanted. Mm-hmm. And it's a much more like concierge / a la carte approach to healthcare, whereas before you would kind of just go to your doctor and they would tell you what you should do. Maybe they would tell you should do nothing. But now people are really trying to like experiment more and push the boundaries, and they want new treatments that are available. So that's one big thing. The other thing, and this also you could argue is accelerated by COVID, is that discourse around mental health and brain health became much more commonplace. This is what drove us to kind of invest in the psychedelic therapeutic space to begin with, but it was accelerated greatly by COVID because you had a bunch of people that were sitting at home, not getting social interaction, rates of mental illness like went through the roof. And so there was already an increased interest in trying to treat the mental health crisis, but it exploded during COVID and it hasn't really gone down as far as I can tell.
Yeah. I from a pharmaceutical and regulatory perspective, I think, again, not to bring it back to COVID, but the ability for companies to mobilize and accelerate the drug development pathway for a therapeutic also opened up new opportunities for the FDA to be a little self-reflective.
And you're talking about the COVID vaccines,
yes.
And the rapid development, right?
Rapid development. Yeah. And so not directly related, but we're talking about now, I guess, other environmental catalysts. Like we saw in 2023 that the FDA released a special guidance on how to conduct trials for psychedelic medicine. But before that, they had also started drafting guidance on incorporating real-world evidence into clinical decision-making, and that is supposed to, in theory, accelerate or strengthen the clinical development pathway of typical drugs, too.
Mm-hmm. Well, just to go back, I want to touch on the real-world evidence thing, but the point about the vaccines is quite interesting because it's sort of, we always thought it takes, 10 years and however many millions of dollars to create a drug. But if you show that one can be created in a very short amount of time, you now have to ask, why can't we create drugs for other things in this short amount of time? Why can't we change the system a little bit? Before we go too down the rabbit hole of all these catalysts, which we already did, we're already down the rabbit hole, maybe we could quickly touch on what human 3 is not, sort of like definition by subtraction, to make sure that people understand what human 3 is. Because we read the manifesto, but I still think that there may be some confusion. So I have a little list here. Can I read through some of them?
Sure.
All right. And then maybe we can talk about them as we go. I'm going to start with the last one on the list, which I think is the most important. It is not a mix of Web3 and biotech.
Oh my God.
Just to be clear, just to be absolutely clear, it is not. It has nothing to do with Web3. I'm not even a crypto guy.
What is this even? Like, is this like a bio DAO? Is that basically how that manifests?
Let's not even acknowledge that exists. But we've had a few people say, "Oh, Web3, Human 3. It's this, is it crypto?" No, it has nothing to do with crypto. All right, so that is one thing that it is not. Sam, how about we kind of alternate on these things?
Sure. Okay.
Do you want to go to the next one?
It's not living forever or uploading consciousness. I think this one's pretty obvious. I mean, we get the uploading consciousness pitch at least once a quarter, maybe.
Yeah. So this is not, and the point above this on our list, this is not like some San Francisco Bay Area transhumanist fantasy that doesn't really have a business model. We are, we're investing in businesses that are going to deliver real things and make real money if they work well. This is not super pie in the sky. It's pie in the sky, but with both feet planted firmly on the ground.
Yeah, I guess another way to say that is no science experiments or...
No science experiments
no projects.
or, hallucinogen-induced grand visions that may or may not even be considered science experiments. All right, so that's another thing that we're clear about here. We're not talking about bringing people back from the dead. We're not talking about just living forever or anything like that. Maybe living a little bit longer, but not forever.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Did I go or did you go?
How about I go again? Okay. And this one, I'd like you to explain this one because I asked you about it earlier. This is not hand-wavy, programmable biology, because that's an actual term we use in certain biotech ecosystems. But what do you mean by that?
All right. Well, these 2 points kind of go together. It's not there is a phenomenon in the Bay Area venture capital circles where I think they're kind of trying to walk around the fact that getting therapeutics approved is difficult and it costs a lot of money and it takes a long time. And so they have these stories where it's like, we're not investing in biotech, we're investing in tech bio. It's like, or programmable biology is another term that they use. And they never really clearly articulate exactly what it means. But the gist is basically, it doesn't have the risks of biotech because it's actually tech first. So like somehow in some ephemeral way that we're not really going to like clarify exactly, you're going to get like these tech-like margins on a biotech-like business, and you're going to somehow be able to make biotech businesses with like the low capital requirements that you might see in tech. And I think that language, whether it's intention to or not, it does mislead people about what they're getting into.
These are the companies that will, and sometimes it works, okay, but I think that very often the pitch is something along the lines of, hey, we're going to de-risk this entire mission by generating earlier revenues than you would with a biotech company through our fantastic, platform and pharma partnerships, and we're going to use
when you
that.
Say you mean like an AI, some kind of drug discovery AI tool that they're building?
Usually it's for new target identification, but whatever tool it is that's supposed to give them an edge for therapeutics development is the first thing that they will ironically say that they're willing to give up to a pharma company for honestly pretty small revenues in the grand scheme of things in terms of value. So I don't know. I think you've talked about this before. We're going down a rabbit hole a little bit, but I get what you're saying.
So we're not trying to hide from the fact that we are in many cases, although not all cases, trying to actually like bring a cure to market or treatment to market. I shouldn't use the word cure, as I've been told many times.
Don't say that.
Yeah, it is funny. I mean, this whole tech bio thing, it's like Sam said, we have this software tool. It's going to allow you to develop drugs at a much faster rate or more efficiently. You should buy it from us. And it's like, well, if it really is that valuable, why don't you just keep it and make your own drugs? I mean, this happened when I used to work at the hedge fund. We would get all these vendors coming in all the time that would be like, we've created this software that allows you to like get some insight into the market. And it's like, if there's really an insight in there, why don't you just use it yourself and like run a hedge fund or something? Why wouldn't, it just doesn't make any sense kind of on the face of it. So yeah, we're not doing that. Although every once in a while we may invest in a company that kind of looks like that, but that is not really like the core of what we do. And the final point here of what Human 3 is not is that we're not focused on like supplements or wellness. And to kind of push on that a little bit further, this is not a anti-modern medicine or anti-mainstream medicine play. It is not saying, the healthcare system is like totally screwed and doctors and pharma are in some conspiracy to keep you sick. No. That's not what this is. Mm-hmm. We have the utmost respect for the medical system and pharma and all the work that goes into developing cures. We just want to speed up the process and to really allow the process to be driven by human outcomes.
It's really interesting to reflect on this list of what Human 3 is not. It reminds me of the antithesis slides that we had for Empath Ventures when it was called Empath Ventures when I first joined. And back then, there was really only one that we had to ward off, which was we don't do cannabis companies. Right. Because, people would see the psychedelics and they'd be like, all right, I guess they do cannabis too. We weren't that kind of fund. And now it's grown, obviously. Can I ask you one of my philosophical rabbit hole adjacent questions that I often ask people that can, be a bit rambly?
Sure.
So based on what I just said, why do you think that with every iteration of, a fund's life cycle and a renewed focus or widened aperture, that there will always be a set of, I guess, adjacent areas that seem to think it's okay to kind of, reach out to these funds, even if it's not explicitly said. So basically, we started to get a lot of good deal flow in other areas, but also some areas we didn't like. I think another antithesis was the functional mushroom space with Empath Ventures. Do you think it's just simply people were trying to find, supporters of what it is that they were doing and looking for signals, or is it more complicated than that?
Well, I think that to put a specific example on the table, I think that when we were approached by the people that were going to put electrodes in your head to make you happier, and it's a very crude way of talking about the amazing brain-computer interface companies we've invested in, that's a pretty radical idea. And so they saw that we were investing in psychedelic medicine, which you could argue is quite radical. And they're like, well, these guys are doing some radical brain stuff. We're also doing a different type of, but still quite radical brain thing. So we should reach out to them. But just practically, there are going to be shifts in indications that are interesting to pursue. In 2018, it wouldn't have made sense to start a COVID company, but in 2021, it did. There are going to be, and as cures get developed for certain diseases, then there probably aren't going to be a lot more research efforts in that specific area. Efforts are going to shift elsewhere. And so you have to be able to adapt a little bit. I want to touch a little real quick, going back to this, we're not tech bio or programmable biology. One of the things that always bothers me about those companies is that they are so tech driven and they do not talk generally. I'm just speaking generalities here. You hear very little about the human endpoint.
Yeah, you're getting revved up. I like this.
Yeah.
I could tell that this is something that bugs you.
Well, it's hard. I think when you're working at the early stages and the idea of getting a drug to humans is seems so far away, it's easy to forget that that's what the end goal is. And when you're a, computer science person who's now pivoting into biology, oftentimes you just don't have that healthcare motivation. And so we see these decks that are very amazing about all these AI drug discovery companies and stuff, but oftentimes they don't even know what indication, to use the technical term, but they don't know what disease they're trying to cure. They just say, we're going to build this amazing thing. It's going to allow us to do all these cool protein predictions and amazing simulations of all the different ways that a molecule can fit into a receptor. But they never really talk about how this is going to change people's lives. And so a lot of the companies, when I look back retrospectively, it's most of the companies we've backed have a very clear vision for who they're helping.
Yeah, but I think...
And then they that's the goal. And then they make the technology go in that direction.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying. I think with a lot of these tech bio companies, the platforms that they're trying to build oftentimes have some element of experimental de-risking that is necessary in order to know what the constraints of the platform actually are. And so there is definitely a reasonable, in my opinion, period of not knowing what indication exactly it is your platform should, in theory, be suited for. What I think is obvious is like you should know which 3 or 4 indications that would benefit from modulation of that specific receptor class. You should know what those are. And so I think there's a spectrum, like everything, of companies that operate on being pretty rational about their experimental design and also like not really taking into consideration not just like the human endpoints, but like the realistic element of what disease they would actually be trying to solve, like reimbursement. And, you know, obviously they're not going to be carrying this asset all the way through to approval, but I think there are other factors that need to be considered. You just brought up like a really good example of a company that in theory had like a really interesting tech that was solving a problem that was somewhat obvious, but somehow they still didn't do that well. So do you feel like this is kind of related to that? Maybe we could talk about that example now or later.
I think maybe we talk about that specific case study later because that might sidetrack us a little bit and it's very long.
Yeah,
so
okay.
We're already talking too long about what Human 3 is not. Maybe we should talk about what Human 3 is.
Yes.
What do you think?
Yes.
Okay. A few points, and I'm not sure which of these is the most important or if they're all equally important, but to you, which of these points that we have here about what Human 3 is like the most important or the one that really kind of like gets you excited?
You know, I think this idea of cross-disciplinarity is something that's been a personal theme of mine, so I'm biased to say that I think that's probably the most important one.
Okay. And just to take everyone back to the Human 3 Manifesto, we talked about how in Human 2, which was the era of modern medicine that we're kind of saying is ending around this time as Human 3 gets launched, it was defined by silos. The chemists worked with other chemists, the biologists worked with other biologists, the neuroscientists worked with other neuroscientists. Why was that, and why is that starting to change now? And are you seeing examples of that actually changing? Because I think cross-disciplinary, like we love that word, and it's the first letter in our name acronym XEIA. The X stands for cross-disciplinary. But let's be honest, it's kind of a buzzword.
It is.
Where's the substance there?
Yeah, I think that historically we had siloed disciplines because our access to knowledge and information in each subdiscipline, that like knowledge acquisition or data acquisition, if you will, was relatively slow. And so I think, you know, we talk about these converging market and technological forces. I think that technology in the past 20 years has gotten to a point where we are now able to synthesize information relatively quickly. And, you know, naturally, each type of discipline has its constraints, and the constraints are where the state of the art is, what the basic research is in that domain. And as you start to access more and more information, scientists are naturally very curious. They look for clues elsewhere to make better assumptions or guesses at what could be happening. And I think a good example of this is in drug discovery, which is like an applied domain. You would see synthetic chemists, medicinal chemists, pharmacologists, molecular biologists all working together in the same lab to try and quickly get an answer to whether or not a drug was a potential candidate for a certain receptor. And over time, I think that's just kind of been amplified to a certain degree, where you're seeing now engineers and, I don't know, chemists talking together, or in biomedical engineering, you're having materials and electrical engineers talking to each other. And I think it's because we've also, at the same time, simultaneously, moved away from this basic curiosity-driven research thinking, which is still critical, to an application thinking, an application-focused thinking, where it's like, how can we actually use something and make something from our discoveries? What can we do to translate this technology into something that humans can benefit from today? And so it's a very long-winded answer. What would your answer be?
Well, hold on. On the subject of cross-disciplinary research, let's go through some examples. The big one is obviously like AI plus biotech, right? Or forget AI, like any sort of computational, anything that's like computational. Only recently, within the last 10, 20 years, has it been the case that like your average chemist also knows Python and can like run simulations of things. Whereas before it was a very different, there was not, the computers did not get married to chemistry right away. But that's kind of obvious, and everyone talks about the intersection of like AI and computational sciences and bio. Obviously, the material sciences and bio, like our company Neuro, their primary innovation is on the material science front. They figured out a way to make this like highly conductive, super small in diameter fiber that can be inserted into the brain through the veins. And that's fantastic. I don't know to what extent there are going to be a lot of breakthroughs in that like material science plus bio crossover, but probably a few. One area of crossover that we've seen a lot of companies try to succeed in is the consumer cross bio space. And the story for people listening is basically like, we have some sort of consumer product. Usually it's some sort of like diagnostic test. So the prime example here is 23andMe. Where you would pay to have your DNA sequenced, and you would get some insights from that. There are a lot of other companies doing something similar, like Viome, which is a microbiome test that you pay a few $100, and you send in your sample. They analyze your microbiome and give you all sorts of like recommendations and stuff. Both 23andMe and Viome and other companies in that vein, they all have some angle, or at least they have an angle that they pitch to investors, which is, the real money is going to come from using all this data that we gather to create some sort of therapeutic. And it's going to be way better than any other therapeutic out there, because unlike these like boring biotech companies or boring like pharma companies, we're actually going directly to the patients, and we are collecting data from them, and we're using this to make inferences, and we have data that no one else has. The problem is no one's actually done this. Every attempt has basically failed. 23andMe went to zero. Viome has been claiming they're going to do this for like 10 years. And I don't think they have a single like phase 1 trial running, even though their consumer side is doing well. And I think there are real like structural impediments to having a successful consumer/bio crossover. For one, the types of investors that want to invest in a consumer company do not really care about bio. And the types of investors that want to do bio don't really care about consumer. And I think the investors really force people to pick a lane. But I actually think the concept makes sense. And so do you think that eventually someone will figure out how to do this, and there will be like a consumer first or a consumer data collection first therapeutics development effort?
I hope it's kernel. I really hope it's kernel, and I'm not just saying that because I'm biased. I think it's achievable.
What is kernel? Because not everyone listening knows what kernel is.
Oh, there's like a cascade of thoughts I have, but we're going to get sidetracked real quick. Kernel.
This is going to turn into a Joe Rogan 4-hour podcast.
Yeah. So let me just write down my thoughts here. I was going to ask you, do you think like what you were going to ask me, or you asked me, what do you think this would be successful, this consumer plus bio one? But then there was a broader question I wanted to go back to that you asked before, so we can go back to that after. But so Kernel, now we're 3 layers deep. Kernel is a neurotech company that was started by and financed by Brian Johnson in 2016. This was the same year, I believe, that Neuralink was founded. And Brian had this grand vision of trying to build the world's best tool for objectively measuring the brain. And, I think after, 6 years, they actually did just that, in my opinion, I think. And Kernel's technology is based on this type of spectroscopy called FNIRS, which is near-infrared spectroscopy. I won't get into all the technical details, but I mention this because Kernel's history is very interesting. Kernel was started in a way as a consumer-facing company, and so
you would pay. The idea was the consumer would pay to have their brain scanned.
No, not. I don't believe that's originally how it was started. I think it was more like, look at this great tech, buy this headset. You can do so much with it. We're gonna build this headset to do X, Y, and Z. You're gonna be able to know when you're having sugar cravings and avoid cereal. And I think that the vision was brilliant because it really created an incentive to build something that wouldn't have normally been built in either academia or by any other big company that did medtech. And so now flash forward to today. A couple of years ago, Kernel's chief technology officer became CEO. His name is Ryan Field, and he's taken the company in a more clinically focused direction. I believe that Kernel can be leveraged in a very exciting way to develop better therapeutics for the brain. And so that's not to say that Kernel won't do brain scans and consumer collection. I think there's a lot of room for that too. But I believe it might be one of the first companies that can achieve both. And, I hope that it does.
I hope so too. And just to throw out one more, because we're still talking about the different types of cross-disciplinarity that we hope to see. The final one, and this in some ways touches on psychedelics, is the crossover between natural products and bio, or natural products and therapeutics development. So, what's so funny? There's a lot going on. This is the first time we're trying to do a podcast like this.
We just have so much to say.
We will get better over time, I promise. So this crossover is basically the idea that there are people in the world that are experts in, botanical products, maybe products that are native to a certain part of the world outside of, the Western world, and that maybe have been used for a very long time by indigenous groups. And there is actually like some evidence that these things do something. And there's a question of, can you take those and turn them into therapeutics? There have been examples of this. The Epidiolex, which is a pharmaceutical grade CBD for epilepsy, was a $7.2 billion acquisition. Aspirin, one of the best-selling drugs of all time, came from the bark of a tree. And as the excitement around computational chemistry started to rise in like the 80s and 90s, people kind of forgot about this natural products inspiration. And now I think to some extent, there's almost like a prejudice against this natural products concept, because it's like, well, people associate that with supplements and like woo-woo and like unsubstantiated thinking. But up until like the 90s, it was like 80% of drugs that got approved were inspired by natural products. And so I think we may end up coming back to that. And part of the reason why that's important and interesting is not just because it's cool. It's because when you have something that has a prior evidence of utility in humans and prior evidence of safety, you can often get to market, or at least get to trials, a lot faster, because it's already shown that this compound is safe in humans, and you kind of already know that it's going to work a little bit. So you're kind of like de-risking the drug development process, which is very different than designing some new molecule in a computer and like hoping it does something, which is honestly what a lot of like modern drug development is. So hopefully we'll get back to that like natural products, bio/therapeutics crossover. Any thoughts on that?
I have a lot of thoughts on that, but before we get there, just to kind of go back to the beginning, you had asked me, like, why do I think that things have become more cross-disciplinary over time? And I gave my answer. I want to come back to this at some point. But another reason for this, and we're jumping around here, that I think is extremely relevant to everything that we're talking about, all of these cross-discipline examples that you're giving. One answer is that, before biotech startups were a thing, it was very rare that you would have just simply scientists and clinical-facing people in a room together. And now I'm talking about this within the context of therapeutics. Large pharmaceutical companies, everyone was siloed in their own department. I honestly think that the trend of groups being more comfortable coming together under this auspice of what is called a startup now, having a clinical advisory team working with scientists really informs that human element of it. And so I wanted to come back to that. I will pose the question to you again. You asked me what I thought about this cross-discipline between natural products and therapeutics. Well, I will say that I'm going to be pedantic. It really does matter how you talk about it. Natural products, nature-inspired. A lot of people use the word nutraceuticals, which is wrong. That's not what it is. I actually think that natural sources, natural molecules, naturally occurring molecules, to be even more precise and accurate, are a fantastic source of inspiration. And there are a number of reasons why. I think that number one, a lot of the structures that occur in nature are just very difficult to synthesize from scratch with like basic starting materials that are petrochemical based. And so that's number one. The second thing is that a lot of these organisms, these plants, and some animals have obviously evolved over many years to be the best version of its species. And so more oftentimes than not, a lot of these molecules that are naturally occurring in nature, including snake venom, by the way, has a very specific biological utility that's already optimized within a specific organism. And so that's not to say that these molecules are ready to go for humans. Oftentimes, chemists will make them better. But I think it's a good way to shortcut the chemical space, if you will.
Sure. Prime example being that Ozempic was from the saliva of the glia. The glia monster. So natural product, not from a plant, but from an animal. Okay. Just reminding myself where we are. We were talking about what Human 3 is, and we said one of the prime things is it's cross-disciplinary. And then we spent a long time talking about that.
But wait,
wait, go ahead.
I was going to ask you the question you asked me at the beginning, and then we jumped to examples. Why do I think that over time we have become more and more cross-disciplinary as...
Here's a dumb potential reason. Could it just be that now we have Google and the internet?
Yeah, access to information, basically.
I mean, if you were a molecular biologist in the 70s, you couldn't just easily look up a bunch of stuff about chemistry or some specific disease. Whereas now you're like, oh, you can easily find the links. You can just go to Wikipedia and click through, and pretty soon you're doing the act of being cross-disciplinary yourself.
Yeah. I also just think that scientists are very naturally curious. And once the Human Genome Project happened and there was a lot more excitement around science, scientific, newsworthy things to talk about, I think it just attracted all scientific minds as well. But anyhow, okay, right. I asked you the question.
We are done with discussing the pillar of Human 3, which is the fact that it's cross-disciplinary, or a cross-disciplinary approach. What are some other things that Human 3 is? Besides being cross-disciplinary, you picked that one. That was the one that was most important to you, yes. Right? So maybe I'll pick two here, or I'll pick one, and then we'll just kind of go through the others.
Start with one.
I thought if I picked two, it'd force me to go quickly through them. I think we talked about it earlier, so this one we can just kind of do very quickly. New technologies that enable faster spins of the scientific method flywheel. And in the manifesto, we talk about all the literal technologies. But there are these social and regulatory technologies that are now coming out. We have a head of the FDA that wants to get rid of phase 3 trials. That allows things to move faster. Even if you ignore these regulatory changes that are happening in the United States, we're starting to see more and more companies take advantage of geographical arbitrage, to use that term incorrectly, to move faster than they might be able to in the US while still having US FDA approval as their North Star. So everything from let's run our phase 1s in Australia, which is, a very legitimate medical regime, but just happens to allow you to get into humans faster. So everything from that to let's go to this weird crypto-affiliated autonomous zone in Honduras where there's basically no regulations and you can just pump things into people however you want, to one of our psychedelic investments that was a ibogaine clinic in Mexico, which is a jurisdiction where ibogaine is not illegal, I think is the proper way to describe it. And so this idea of let's figure out how we can just maneuver around the regulations a little bit, not doing anything wrong or illegal, but just within the confines of the law, what are the different strategies we can employ to move faster? That's one of them. And then some of these other technologies, we sort of touched on it with this natural products bit that we were talking about earlier. But if you have a product that is an extract of or a derivative of something that already exists in nature and that there's prior evidence of efficacy of in humans, you can potentially just leapfrog your phase 1, your safety trials, because you already know it's safe, and you could potentially even use some of that prior evidence in humans, even though it's like observational and not double-blind placebo-controlled, as sort of a proof point that this thing is going to work. And this is obviously the case for any like psychedelic related company, but it's also the case for Cadence, which is the premature ejaculation company we backed, which uses a South African succulent plant called canna as kind of its inspiration.
I don't necessarily think we're at a place where real world data and anecdotal evidence can necessarily enable a leapfrogging of the phase 1 safety studies. But I think we might be able to get there in the next 2 decades once there's enough knowledge and I guess perhaps, things can be modeled out more accurately. But yeah, you're right. I think that definitely helps things along. I mean, it was really shocking. I alluded to this earlier, seeing the FDA release a draft guidance on how to run psychedelic trials. Yeah. That to me was, and I spoke with the woman who wrote that at Psychedelic Science in Denver, off the record, and she was a contributor, and she basically told me that, yeah, of course, this real world evidence that exists, whether it be on Reddit or through trip reports or just observational work that other groups have published, or even the work that was done before the war on drugs, all enabled the FDA to take a more holistic view at whether or not they would actually draft a guidance that would support this.
It's true. And so just having a regulatory body that's like working with the people that are submitting these trials is helpful. But beyond just psychedelics, the FDA also seems to be doing things that are aimed at speeding up the process. So just recently, like 2 or 3 weeks ago, they released, I don't remember if there was a name of this initiative, but it was basically, they said, we're no longer going to require that you do full animal toxicology work for monoclonal antibody drugs. Is that what it was, right?
Yeah,
they said now you're gonna if you're trying to develop a new monoclonal antibody, you don't have to do like a pig toxicity study, which would be expensive and take a long time. You can now use these either lab-grown organoids or AI models of toxicity. And they didn't really go into specifics of what all that meant, and there's some skepticism, but generally I think this idea of let's figure out how we can eliminate anything that is like wasteful in the process is probably the right direction to go. That's the right line of inquiry.
Yeah. And, some people say that it's because perhaps that we already know what the safety profile of monoclonal antibodies are. Others jokingly say that we already know how damaging and toxic they are to people, so why bother doing more clinical studies? But that is true. There's definitely evidence of the FDA being pretty progressive on a number of fronts. There are a lot of these working groups, these committees, even especially on the medical device side, where they get experts from different stakeholder groups to come together and advise on what the real world looks like. And not a lot of people know about that, but it's a thing. But yeah, I think it's a pretty good initiative, I would say.
And so if we were to recap some of these points we just made, what is Human 3? It's a company building a Human 3 company, let's say. A Human 3 company is a company that is employing some sort of new technology and it could be a literal technology or like a regulatory or social technology that enables faster spins of the scientific method flywheel. It is a company that is cross-disciplinary in some sense. Probably those are probably 2 big cores. And what we have noticed is that, at least for us, what's most exciting about this is that we think it's going to allow for progress to be made in areas of health and wellness or well-being. I should stop using wellness. It sounds like, a magazine that you might see at like the grocery store. It is going to allow progress to be made in areas of health and well-being that were previously lagging. And we talk a lot when we're pitching LPs about the fact that we've made tremendous progress in cancer over the last 50 years. Way better to get cancer today than it was, however long ago. But it's not clear that it's better to get some sort of diagnosis, some sort of psychiatric disorder or neurodegenerative disease today than it was before. We haven't made a lot of progress in those areas. And the hope is that these new tools and technologies and this cross-disciplinary thinking is going to allow us to finally start making breakthroughs in these areas that have historically kind of lagged.
And these areas that have historically kind of lagged, would you say that there has been a lack of significant we use this term step change a lot, but a lack of significant innovation in each of these areas in and of itself. So we talk about like neuro, so neurodegenerative disease, neuropsychiatry. If you look to neuropsychiatry as an example of this, we haven't really seen a new drug approved for depression that's been innovative and maybe new scientifically in a while. So how do you fit, we talked about these points, but we always talk about this idea that we want to invest in companies that can enable a step change in their respective categories. How do you fit that all together in your mind?
Well, so, okay. We actually have seen a drug approved for depression recently that was a breakthrough, Spravato.
Right.
Which does fit the human through criteria in that it is kind of taking inspiration from a long existing substance that we kind of have prior evidence.
It's been around for a while.
It's been around for a long time.
It's not de novo.
It's not a natural product, but it's, ketamine has been around for a very long time. And it's been known that anecdotally, that it works to treat depression, and they created a special version of it to treat depression. So that's kind of the one big success, is following one of these human through principles, which is forget about all this AI drug discovery stuff. Let's focus on things that have prior evidence in humans, things that we kind of know work. The other thing is that you were talking about companies like Kernel that have these new ways to image the brain more cheaply and accurately than we could before. That is an example of a new tool that may allow us to do a better job of developing therapeutics for the brain. Part of the reason why I suspect that we've had little progress in brain disorders is just because we don't have good diagnostics or measurements for the brain, which we do for most other parts of the body. But the brain's very hard to measure. So new technologies will help there. Mm-hmm. Does that answer the question or no?
No.
What was the repeat the question?
So the question that I asked was, how do you think about, I guess it does in a way, like I wanted to know how you thought about how enabling a step change in a respective category ties in with all these other elements of human three, like
the step change point. Yeah. Well, okay. We didn't touch on that, but we are generally looking for things that if they work will be a step change. Yeah. And I would argue that anytime you are looking at an area where there hasn't been a lot of progress, like neuro, for example, it's kind of like easier to make a step change there than it is in an area where there has been a lot of progress, like cancer, right? Like any improvement in depression outcomes is probably going to be seen as a step change.
So just to round out this thought with the ketamine example that you countered with, I don't disagree that it's an innovative drug that's been approved for treatment-resistant depression. But if you look at the history of drug development for general depression historically, and the drugs that are prescribed today, there hasn't been, in the top 10 drugs that are prescribed for depression today, none of those are really stemming from any like de novo, like drug discovery in CNS for the past 10 years. They're all like off label, or they're all generic. So that's kind of what I was trying to say. With respect to ketamine, it's a little bit of a different example, but yeah, I think that what we want to invest in, if we're talking about neuropsych, for example, since I'm on that topic, is a company that's looking at a new class of therapeutics for depression, or a new target, not something that's been tried and been done before already. So that's kind of the way I think about it a little bit. Do you know what I mean?
Well, yeah. I mean, how about you give your answer while I close the window, because there are people being loud outside and I don't want it to be picked up on the mics.
Yeah. How about we pause?
Okay. There is one final point of what Human 3 is that is particularly interesting to me as someone who cares a lot about human optimization. And it is this idea of distribution shifting treatments, therapies, technologies, whatever you want to call them. All right, here's the concept. So traditionally, if you think of like the bell curve of different, whatever, health levels or something, the bell curve, you have very, very sick people on the left, very, very healthy people on the right. Most people are on the median. Pretty much all traditional drug development or biotech has been focused on basically just truncating the left tail, just like getting rid of any, sick people, not getting rid of them, but making them go back towards the middle.
Don't say that.
So it's this idea that like, let's just take whoever's over in that left tail and squish them towards the middle.
Make them less sick.
Right, make them less sick. it has very little interest in taking people that are already at that middle point and pushing them towards the right tail. There's almost no interest in like taking you from the median to the exceptional. And if you go to a doctor and if you run your labs, what do they always say? You're in the normal range, right? And you say, well, I don't want to be in the normal range. I want to be exceptional. They're like, that's not my job. And we feel that there is just a lot of interest from the population due to all these forces that we talked about at the beginning of the podcast in, hey, I'm already healthy, but I want to be more healthy. I want to like take things to the next level. And there are a lot of drugs that can be used for both and shift the entire distribution of health outcomes. Ozempic and GLP-1s being like the biggest example, the most relevant example, because if you're morbidly obese, Ozempic will help you significantly, right? But if you're 20 pounds overweight, probably in the normal range, but you just want to get to that next level, Ozempic can also help you.
And give you gastroparesis.
Maybe there are some side effects, but that's, besides the point. And there are probably innumerable other drugs out there that have that sort of distribution shifting potential.
Yeah, I think so. It's funny when you were talking about this and describing it, in my mind, I'm like cueing the conspiracy theorists who say that all that biotech and pharma and capitalism does is actually move people from the median to the left.
Well, like I said earlier, we are not anti-modern medicine, anti-pharma.
We have to state that
I do
again.
not believe in those conspiracies.
Yeah. No, I agree with you. There's a lot of room for... I call it like a prophylactic window because a lot of the diseases that have the most to gain from modern medicine that haven't yet, or new technology, I should say, they're diseases that are like kind of subperceptual for us. We don't have good diagnostics for them. There isn't really a good set of biomarkers that define when the onset is, and oftentimes they manifest when it's kind of too late. So this idea that we could use drugs and also maybe some other technology to widen that prophylactic window is also very interesting to me.
Yeah, and there are quite a few examples of drugs that are distribution shifting. I mean, one of the biggest ones outside of like the Ozempic type drugs are hormones for hormone replacement therapy, right? Like these things can be used to correct serious like hormonal issues, like people that are born with, HPTA like issues that don't produce enough testosterone if they're men, et cetera. But also if you are someone who is getting older and the doctor says like your testosterone is normal for your age and you're like, well, I don't know that I want to be normal for my age. I want to feel younger. You can go do hormone replacement therapy. There's all these like experimental stem cell treatments that are probably best suited for people that have had, serious injuries to their joints through like some accident or something. And, the stem cells help repair that. But there are also people, maybe athletes, that just want to have stronger joints, even though their joints are already strong, and those stem cell treatments could help them with that. You can get into the cognitive stuff, and this is where it gets a little bit more speculative, right?
Nicotine.
Well, I don't know if we want to get into nicotine on this podcast.
Yeah.
I think we could do a whole hour on nicotine. But, in theory, if you have a drug that treats the cognitive decline of Alzheimer's, why shouldn't it also make someone who's not in a state of cognitive decline get a little bit smarter? I mean, some people try this on a self-experimentation scale with things like Adderall, right? But this is where you can kind of start seeing how the road to all of this like longevity and human optimization stuff can be rooted in like real science that's involved in healing sick people. It's drugs that like do actually have a utility in healing the sick, and that if you just take them, if you are, somewhat healthy and normal, could potentially give you a bit of an extra edge. And obviously you have to be very cognizant of side effects and overuse, and you don't want to push prescriptions on anyone. But I personally have always been interested in this sort of like human optimization type stuff. And there's a lot of it that's BS, but there's a lot of it that I think is grounded in science and can work.
Yeah, I think this is honestly the main reason why the Human 3 opportunity is actually so exciting, because you have a population that's in need. You have an unmet medical need that your solution is, treating or solving. But if it has potential to extend the quality of life for somebody as well, then I think it's a whole other consideration, that a whole other set of opportunities. And, I want to go back to an example you mentioned, like hormone replacement. I actually saw on X the other day a woman who's completely healthy. She's a 40-year-old woman who runs a nonprofit in the Bay. And she basically said that she decided to start taking testosterone, and it's like improved her life dramatically in terms of cognitive clarity. Now, I don't know what the dose was or what have you, but she seemed to feel like this was improving her quality of life. And so obviously there's a fine line between self-experimentation without sufficient knowledge of what the potential consequences are, but also, like, I guess you could call it, is the term citizen science, or like, autonomously led like experimentation that is quite informative to the scientific community as well. Like, as someone who's been personally interested in this idea of, enhancement with, substances or interventions, what do you think about that?
Well, this is where, in some ways, the whole idea of trying to turn psychedelics into pharmaceuticals came from, right? It's like you had a bunch of people that self-experimented with psychedelics. Some of them did it because they were diagnosed with serious depression, but many of them did it because they just wanted to see the world in a different way and like broaden their thinking. And who knows if they actually achieved that, but that's the idea, right? It's not necessarily that everyone that does mushrooms or acid thinks that they're like curing some disease. Yeah. They're just trying to broaden their mind, expand their mind. And if you look at a lot of the portfolio companies we've invested in, many of them have this angle. So, I mean, Superpower, which is the consumer-facing diagnostics company, you pay $500, you get a whole blood panel done, and doctors will help figure out how you can reach whatever goals you have, informed by the background of your biometric data. That obviously has that sort of distribution shifting potential, because if you're sick, we can fix you. If you're already healthy and you want to go to the next level, we know what to do because we have the data. Motif Neurotech, this is a company developing a minimally invasive brain implant for treatment-resistant depression, is like the initial indication. But, there's reason to believe that the type of electrical stimulation that they're using to treat the depression could be tuned to just give, for example, focus on demand. So let's say that you have this implant and you need to pull a 12-hour working session to like get ready for this board meeting or hack away on this like demo or whatever. You open the app, you press the button, the stimulation starts, and you're locked in for the next 12 hours. Mm-hmm. Mind State Design Labs, which is designing, precision psychedelic therapeutics, they want to be able to reliably induce any sort of cognitive state with their sort of primer probe psychedelics model. That obviously has this like distribution shifting potential where we're not just healing people that have, PTSD or treatment-resistant depression or these diseases that you normally think about when you're thinking about psychedelics, but anyone could potentially induce any sort of mind state for any sort of mind-expanding purposes. And then most of the companies in our portfolio have this potential, but the funniest example, of course,
I was going to say there's one that's doing both at the same time already.
Which one is that?
Cadence.
Right. So Cadence is the... do you want to explain?
Yeah, I'd love to.
All right.
So the reason why I said that is because Cadence Bio is a therapeutics company that's in clinical development right now, that's developed a drug that is solving a specific health problem. But at the same time, you could argue that this has an immediate effect on the individual's quality of life. And who knows? I mean, maybe this becomes something that's approved and is prescribed off-label. We can talk about what that means. But essentially what Cadence is doing is developing a drug for premature ejaculation in men. So you could actually consider that in a way, not just men's health, but like women's health indirectly too. And so I would say Cadence is probably the most, it's like Cadence is at the singularity of this concept right now.
Sure. Well, and the precedent in the other prescription men's health products like Viagra this is a great case study here, because like many men who do not actually have erectile dysfunction take Viagra because they want what they perceive as like an extra edge.
Really?
Oh yeah.
I'm totally joking.
You obviously didn't. Hey, I don't know. And so they take this, and it's, I think, probably going to be the same thing with Cadence, right? Like, what is even the technical definition of premature ejaculation? What if you just have a normal ejaculatory latency, which is the technical term that I learned after investing in Cadence, but you just want to extend it? right? And this is so there are plenty of examples of where these cures, treatments, therapeutics have that distribution shifting potential. This is sort of an analogy to how a lot of the tech world right now is talking about dual use technologies. Like it's got a consumer application and a military application. Our version of dual use is distribution shifting, where we're not just truncating the left tail, we're helping people move to the right tail if they want to.
Yes, indeed.
All right.
Indeed.
Enough. So that is what Human 3 is. It is things that have this distribution shifting potential. It's new companies that take advantage of new technologies to enable faster spins of the scientific method flywheel. And it is teams that specifically are thinking in a cross-disciplinary method. This could be anything from as basic as a combo of AI and bio to material science and bio to maybe even some consumer/bio stuff. To natural products and natural history intersecting with bio and biotherapeutics development.
Yeah, and if any of you want a quick synopsis of that, you just go to our website and the manifesto is there. If you forget everything we said or didn't even listen to this, that's okay.
I want to jump to, we talked a lot about neuro and how that has been, again, neuro being a catch-all term for psychiatric disorders, addiction, neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's, dementia, and Parkinson's. That has been the bulk of what we've invested in. That is where we think this Human 3 concept or theme is going to move the needle the most in the near term. Mm-hmm. But there are other areas that we're interested in that we think maybe Human 3 will kind of like creep into over time.
Indeed.
Yeah. So these are potential avenues of expansion. I mean, what they are. What are the most interesting to you, Sam?
I am really excited to see where we get to with women's health and just the fertility crisis in general. I think that, obviously it's in the news, it's on X all the time. Maybe my algorithm is showing it to me because of my age. I don't know, but it's saying no one's having babies anymore. We're in a fertility crisis all around the world. Our species is dying. What's the problem? And I think an obvious answer to that is the fact that obviously people are choosing to have children when they're older. But it is true objectively that there definitely is some biology involved in that too, whether it's because you are decidedly waiting until a certain age or because we're less of a healthy population. And so I'm really interested in this idea of sexual and reproductive health being enabled by Human 3 and putting a little bit more of the decision-making and ownership into parents' hands, women's hands. Women's health has a lot to gain from new data acquisition. Let's start there. But many other areas.
The fertility crisis is probably one of the most obvious demographic trends that you could see, right? It's
pretty bad.
It is like every country on the planet, with the exception of Israel, is like trending downwards.
That's terrible.
Yeah. And it has been for a long time. And it seems and people have tried all sorts of different things. Some countries are offering these like baby bonuses. Those don't seem to move the needle.
What's $5,000 for a kid each year? Well, I think there was
no. So other countries are offering like 50 to 100K and it's not moving the needle.
Yeah.
So obviously some of this is choice, but like you said, people are waiting longer, and so they're more infertile, and there need to be better solutions so that people can more reliably have children when they want to and when they can afford to.
Yeah.
And there have not been innovations in things like IVF in quite a long time. The technology is largely the same as it has been for a long time. These are not companies that are like about to be invested in by us or anything, but what would be like 2 or 3 concepts for a Human 3 reproductive or fertility health company?
Well, I think this idea of, this is a bit of an amorphic one, but giving women the ability to understand the uniqueness of their reproductive condition, whether that's endometrial health, whether that's why and what the different type of cysts they have is. Polycystic ovarian syndrome is very common, but that often presents itself with different types of abnormalities too. I actually think like this consumer/bio crossover might do the best here because it is leaning more towards that personal data collection and ownership, which is something that we haven't seen for a while. Someone I've known for a long time actually started a company that I think is going to kick us off in this direction. Her name is Marina. She started Eli Health. It's going to be the first diagnostic essentially at home that you could use to measure your hormone levels through your saliva. I mean, that's pretty cool. So I think that's definitely a general amorphic answer that I have. What about you?
What about artificial wombs? You don't have to have the baby yourself. You don't have to pay for a surrogate. You just have
Brave new world. I think that's cool. I mean, if it takes the burden off the family in some way to continue working or giving their full time and attention to getting ready for the baby, and that makes them more likely to want to have a baby, then I think that's a positive thing.
Sure. What about, I mean, we looked at a company that was quite interesting not too long ago called Paterna, which basically argued that they approached the problem from a men's health perspective. And they made the point that supposedly 50% of the times that IVF fails, it's because of poor sperm quality or no sperm for that matter from the father. And so they had developed a procedure that they claimed was the first of its kind, where they could basically take stem cells, testicular stem cells, and turn those into healthy sperm that would then be used in the IVF process.
That's pretty cool.
So that's an example of another, I mean, to me, that sort of fits kind of like the human 3 vibe. And they also had a number of strategies for, maybe there are certain regulatory regimes out there where this type of procedure could go to market quite quickly. And so they were kind of like checking a number of the boxes and the human 3. Quite a few of the human 3 pillars. So that was quite interesting. Anything else that you want to touch on in fertility or reproductive and sexual health?
I just want to say, like, obviously we don't have a lot of data on the women's health side of things, so it's hard to make this assumption confidently. But women's hormones and women's biology, there's a lot of overlap between things like inflammation, and I just feel like if there's ever going to be like an ultimate biological challenge to solve in a cross-disciplinary manner, this is like an area that has a lot to gain from that. And so maybe these types of tech bio companies that are looking at multi-omics technology to do new target ID, is there another type of data that we could collect, maybe from menstrual blood or from vaginal discharge or from a spit, that can actually like inform us of a better picture of what's happening to the individual at that moment in time. Not to go on a rant too much about women's health, but
let me put you on the spot real quick, if that's okay. I think everyone listening to this podcast knows that femtech, that's a term that's been kind of in the zeitgeist probably since 2016, 2017. Right? There's been a move for like these femtech companies to come up.
Yeah.
Why has there not? I mean, obviously some of these companies have succeeded to some extent, but how come we haven't had the big breakthroughs that people want in women's health, even though there's been all this hype around let's invest in women, femtech is this category
because
now.
It's easier to like create a new glamorous period cup than it is to develop like a better drug or find a new drug target.
So you think that maybe there's a lot of, maybe not intentionally, but sort of like cynical approaches where they're like, oh, this is a trend I can hop on.
Yeah.
Okay.
And it's also like ironically very stereotypical because a lot of these end up like consumer brands that are like wellness focused.
And
maybe backed by a lot of LA
science-driven.
VCs,
Yeah.
not very science driven.
The LA VC is the worst. Speaking as someone who was an LA VC up until 5 months ago.
Yeah, but to call out someone who I know is building in this space, Morgan Stanton of Opal Therapeutics. I've been tracking her for some time. I think she's the only person I've met who's doing new target drug discovery for women's health. So, yeah, I mean, I think it's because it's a trendy thing. You make something pink and glitzy, and you call it femtech, and then all of a sudden you can start making money and not have to worry about solving this like big medical problem.
So what you're saying is pink and glitzy consumer-facing femtech products are not human 3.
No, they are not.
They're not human 3.
They're not. No, My Little
Solving
Pony.
real problems is human 3.
Yes,
Okay, got it. Okay,
God, I sound
so
awful.
that's one area that we are. That's one area that we're looking out for coming up. What are some other disease areas that we think might be like positively lifted by these like human 3 principles or this human 3 approach to company building?
Yeah, I think so. It's hard to say. So autoimmune disease inflammatory disease, chronic disease, these are all kind of tied together. And I think it's been hard to innovate here specifically with different conditions that are based on symptom clusters because, again, we don't have a good set of biomarkers that define, let's say, long COVID or dysautonomia or these general symptom clusters that, can be treated by many of the same drugs that other diseases in this category are treated with. So I think there is something to, again, be gained from the new data that we're generating in these categories and get more specific about how we treat people with certain disease. I think a good example of this is Raynaud's disease. Some people call it Raynaud's, which is the French pronunciation. It's basically an autoimmune condition that can occur on its own or as a comorbidity with another autoimmune disease that causes your capillaries to constrict and stay constricted, which can morph into many other problems. And Raynaud's is really primarily treated with lifestyle change and also beta blockers, which were never engineered for that in the first place. And so I think there's definitely a lot of room for innovation in these categories.
Yeah. And why do you think, we talked about why there hasn't been a lot of innovation in neuro and the brain, and one of the big reasons is there aren't very good diagnostic techs available. Why has there not been a lot of innovation here in this like chronic disease, sort of like autoimmune, inflammation-driven disease category?
I'm not an immunologist, so I can't say this with certainty, but it kind of goes back to what I just said. It's like, if you can't specifically define what the problem is, and there are these overlapping symptom clusters, and it's hard to recruit patients for these trials in a very segmented way, it's hard to prove out. I was just talking to somebody who was basically like, we have this drug that we know works in immunology. We know it works in autoimmune. Now we just have to select what autoimmune disease we're going to go after. And they're in phase 2. So they still haven't decided. And you know what he said to me? He was like, I think because of all of these clinical development logistical constraints, like patient recruitment and finding people with this specific type of disease, we're going to probably just do psoriasis because that's what everyone de-risks in an autoimmune disease, which is fine for proof of concept. But, I think a lot of it has to do with, again, maybe patients also not getting recognized for what these symptoms are or diagnosed properly. So they don't have like a medical health record that puts them as a clinical trial candidate for this type of thing on a doctor's radar, let's say, or a KOL's radar. And so, yeah, I think long COVID was a good opportunity for a lot of innovators in this space to be like, well, maybe there's a new category of people we can recruit to our trials to see if, their symptoms alleviate. The other thing I'd say is that these symptoms are very sporadic. They are drawn out. It's hard to measure endpoints, similar to neurodegenerative disease, which is, very long, the progression. It's hard to kind of see a movement on an endpoint in a clinical trial there because it's a longitudinal study. With things like, for example, long COVID, they're episodic. There's always some kind of catalyst that induces these episodes, and it's hard to induce an episode in a clinical trial.
Yeah. So, we talked earlier about how one of these cross-disciplinary type approaches could be consumer plus biotherapeutics development. It seems to me this might be one of the most well-suited areas for this, because I'd imagine that someone with one of these chronic unexplainable diseases would be willing to pay money to track their symptoms, run a lot of experimental diagnostics, and just build up a case over time.
Yeah.
And that data probably, maybe, you may be able to capture data in that way that far exceeds what you might be able to capture in a normal sort of closed-end trial.
I agree. I think physician education has a lot to do with it too. Don't get me started on the experience that I've had being Canadian and experiencing the Canadian healthcare system and what my new experience in the US paying for insurance has been like. I'm very lucky to be able to afford to pay for my healthcare here, but it's night and day, even in terms of knowledge of what's cutting edge. And I don't think that's necessarily anyone's fault, but that's just a societal problem. So maybe there's a societal catalyst that we need too.
Yeah, definitely. Well, okay, let's think. What other things are important to discuss here? I mean, we've kind of done, I think, a pretty good job of covering what Human 3 is, what the principles are, what a Human 3 company, describing what a Human 3 company may look like. We talked about what areas we may be interested in going forward. One quick note that I have is this is a point about where things may not be going forward. And this is, we're entering speculation about the future mode, which is never a good thing. But we've invested in a lot of neurotech, or when I say neurotech, I mean brain computer interface, BCI companies. And I think those companies are going to do great. I love every single BCI company we've invested in. I don't know about you, but I'm starting to get the feeling or starting to see things in the neurotech space that are reminiscent of psychedelics like end of 2021, early 2022. And just to give you a concrete example of that, it's like starting to see a lot more pitches that are like lower quality, being which is indicative of people that don't really have any business playing in the sandbox jumping on the hype train because they see a lot of dollars going this way. They see Neuralink raising in a $9 billion valuation, and they want to ride the train too. Do you know, you've noticed that, I'm sure.
Yeah, and I think one of the reasons for this is that when you have an exciting area, like a frontier technology, whether it's psychedelics or neurotech, that starts to be taken seriously in the scientific and clinical communities, you basically it's actually a great catalyst because it's a forcing function for tech that's translatable immediately and commercializable. And so those companies get started. And eventually, all of the new physics, engineering, and chemistry and biology that's de-risked in that area has been started, and IP has been generated, and a company has been formed. And so when you're out of those ideas, there's no room to iterate on new basic tech. And I think people get excited about it. There's a sense of FOMO, and it's also a good North Star for people who are like starting out their careers. And so I've seen a lot of young people talking about like neuro AI and leveraging already existing technology to kind of maybe somehow end up in neurotech in an adjacent way. That's a very specific example of what I could be thinking about. I'm not shitting on those companies or anything like that, but I just think that, those are a lot of the reasons why we see this like hype wave, and I agree with you. I think that there's only so many new types of inventions stemming from new physics that can be created within a specific time frame.
Yeah. I would argue it's maybe even more simple than that, which is that when there's a new area of interest, there are a number of obvious ideas and low-hanging fruit. And once those companies get started, those are probably going to be the category winners.
Everything else ends up mimicry.
Yeah, basically.
Yeah.
And maybe there will be like another wave where the problem is that it's like it takes 5 to 10 years for any of these companies to get to market, but it doesn't take very long for a company to like get started. And so you have like this rush to grab the low-hanging fruit. And, maybe all 5 to 10 companies that are grabbing the low-hanging fruit get formed within a period of 2 years. But it still takes, 5 to 10 years for any of them to actually like get to market and prove that this whole like concept of neurotech or psychedelics or whatever works. And so there's sort of like a waiting period. It's different than some area like B2B SaaS where maybe a new segment is uncovered and companies can immediately launch and start generating revenue and prove themselves out. And so you kind of have like these waiting periods. And in the waiting periods, you see a bunch of people that don't really have an up close and informed view of the space trying to just like jump on when they don't realize that what they're doing has maybe already been done or is very iterative or whatever.
That's why it's important to understand who exactly everyone is, immerse yourself in the ecosystem, also know who's working on something that's similar in academia before making an informed decision, which I think is naturally how we were able to kind of expand into neurotech. Because I think, like you've mentioned before, there's an overlap of interest, and so we got exposed to this quite early. And staying ahead of that curve is important too. So that's kind of homework for us all the time. But
that's right, ahead of the curve.
I was going to ask you something because, we're wrapping up, I think.
I hope so. We've been talking for a long time. I got to go to New York tomorrow.
Yeah, I think that, if I were listening to us for the past however long we've been talking.
I'd say they ramble. No,
that for sure. And maybe Sam needs to do more podcasts so she can get practice speaking. But the other thing I'd probably say is that we spent a lot of time talking about this consumer/bio dichotomy theme, cross-disciplinary idea. And we talked about it in a very negative light, but we also talked about it in a positive light. So I kind of want to clear the record for people on why, up until this point, this idea of like consumer bio has rubbed us the wrong way. Like we talked about it seeming like very difficult, but I've seen you explain this very well. You talk about how it's running two separate businesses. Can you explain that a little bit more?
Yeah. So the common pitch is we want to develop this therapeutic, but in the meantime, we're going to sell these diagnostics kits that are a special diagnostic that we developed. And of course, the data that we generate from these diagnoses is going to be used to inform the therapeutics development. But the problem is that running a consumer company and a therapeutics development company are two totally different ballgames. It's a different set of skills. It informs who you hire. It informs your capital deployment strategy. It informs the type of investors that you want in your cap table, because there are certain investors that prefer, high capital expenditure up front and bigger return at the end, or more incremental revenue generation type companies. So it is very hard to straddle both of those worlds. And so I think it is totally understandable why we haven't seen any of these companies really work. And the ones that have worked the best have only worked well on one side of the straddle.
Yeah.
So like Viome, as far as I know, is actually making quite a bit of money on their consumer side. But if you listen to interviews with the CEO back in 2016, his vision is to like cure disease. And I don't think they've made any progress towards curing disease with new therapeutics. So it's like they're succeeding at one thing, but not the other.
Maybe they just end up with, the exclusive right to license, whatever it is that they...
Maybe.
But so I guess, yeah, that's...
So it's a cautious optimism around that space.
Even if there were magically some new investor archetype to emerge overnight in early stage VC that is like, we understand consumer and bio, and we're only going to invest in these types of companies, that doesn't solve the problem of scaling the company, because therapeutics is very capital intensive. I don't think you could offset the cost with the revenues from your diagnostic or a consumer product.
100%.
And eventually you have to talk to the biotech investors.
So you can probably get launched with, some new open-minded Bay Area VC, but when it comes time to raise that Series A or Series B to run the phase 2 trial, those investors are they're going to say, get rid of this consumer crap. And to be clear, we've invested in 0 companies that fit this mold, and we're not even saying we will in the future. I just think it's an interesting area of cross-disciplinarity, because a lot of the other areas of cross-discipline are just like two different STEM fields. And that's interesting, but it's kind of obvious. Whereas like, let's take something that's STEM and not STEM and put them together.
Not to throw a wrench in this and make this podcast even longer, but there's a good example of this being done successfully. And it's a mid-cap pharmaceutical company that does this, actually. It's Otsuka. Otsuka has their pharmaceutical arm that does drug development in CNS and nephrology and some other therapeutic areas. But they also, because they're a giant company, relatively speaking to startups, they have this Otsuka Precision Health arm that focuses on consumer products and using that data to inform their therapeutics development. And I think they obviously can get away with that, because I think their market cap's like $40 billion or something. But as a startup, you can't do that.
It would be interesting to see where they started and at what point they started doing that. I mean, there are a number of Johnson & Johnson, they sell No More Tears shampoo and ketamine, right? So they have the whole spectrum of things, consumer products and pharmaceuticals. But
these are giant companies that
these are not
arguably
startups.
they're not startups.
So it's a very different. You can't really take lessons from those companies and apply them to startups.
But yes, definitely not. Okay, so where are we here?
I think we're definitely near the end, and I think that we should just say whatever closing thoughts we have, and then press stop, and we'll do another podcast in a week or two.
I think. First of all, thank you for having me.
Well, yeah, I'm kind of amazed that we haven't done a podcast since December of 2022, even though we've been working together basically consistently since then.
I think there's a lot to talk about. I feel like if you've listened to us this long, thank you for your patience. I would like to do more, because I find that when I talk to you, someone who works with me all the time and knows me very well, there's always a ton of things to talk about, and it's actually more challenging to get pointed things across the table. And so I think, at least for my personal development, I would love to continue doing this. But I also think that I'm excited about Human 3. I feel very privileged to be continuing on this journey with you 3 years later, almost 3 years later. And I'm really excited to be in the Bay Area and to meet cool people here and continue to hang out with, nerds and biotech people and all that stuff.
Well, it sounds like if you're a cool nerd in the Bay Area, you should slide into Sam's LinkedIn DMs and hang out there. She does run the San Francisco Biotech Run Club.
Yes, please.
Maybe we should call it the Human 3 Run Club.
Yeah, you can call it that too.
I do not participate in the Run Club because I am not Human 3 enough to be able to run well. So I do other things while the Run Club is taking place. But yeah, this has been fantastic. I think we covered a lot of good points. Hopefully this at least provides a lot of background that people can use to kind of like build up a view of what Human 3 is, what the principles are, what a Human 3 company looks like. And if you are a founder that this resonates with, which by the way, one thing that did surprise me when we put up that Human 3 Manifesto on the website back in January is that so many founders did reach out to us.
They reference it.
And even today when we get cold emails, they're like, hey, I think Human 3 is really cool. We're building in something that is Human 3-ish. And so here it is. Now, of course, they do that because they want our attention. But I think it's kind of nice that there's something to grab onto there.
Yeah.
Rather than if we just said we do biotech, it's like we are a biotech company. It's kind of yeah. I think it does seem to resonate with people, and so I'm glad that we coined a term.
Yeah.
And hopefully it catches on. All right, so that's pretty much it. If you're building in Human 3, if you are a founder or a researcher, XEIA. XEIA VP, that stands for Venture Partners, XEIAVP.com. You can find me on LinkedIn, Brom Rector, Sam on LinkedIn at Sam Tabone. Contact us. We'd love to chat. And Sam, thank you so much for doing this late night podcast. And I'm sure first of many.
Awesome.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.